So I think this has been a quite momentous week in many ways, and I'm going to do more than one video actually talking about what has happened this week and some of the implications of some of the announcements, or one particular announcement actually. So this week was when Apple announced the Vision Pro, which is this new headset they've got, this augmented reality, digital reality headset. So before we talk about that specifically, let's just track through the world of computing and that journey. And again, my reference point is geospatial or spatial. Let's use that word spatial. So I think if we go back to the early 90s, when I was just beginning to go to graduate school, actually, that time was really around where we had sort of dumb terminals. We had ArcInfo as on a dumb terminal. We had ArcView on a very expensive desktop computer, but we were living in isolation. We were basically working and doing our magic on these new things called desktop computers. But it was around about that time that the internet came out. So computers themselves became much more attractive because the price of desktops was coming down and you weren't living in isolation anymore. You were part of a distributed system, so you could communicate with other people. So you could start building sort of a network, if you like, beyond just the isolation of you being on a computer. So that was an important big step. But the interface, which is really what I want to talk about here, was not very user friendly, to be fair. People had to learn how to use Windows, for example, or the Mac OS, and it a lot of times it wasn't very intuitive. And I think about my wife, and she hated, still to this day hates to navigate folders and find things. It was just awful. So it wasn't the greatest user experience, but it was a first step for the majority, the majority, for the world to start using digital technology and computers themselves. So that was huge. That was in the 90s where that really started to roll. What happened at the end of the 2000s was the mobile revolution. And a lot of us remember the early mobile phones were pretty crude, but then we got smartphones. Now, smartphones are a massive step forward. Why? Because they put computers in people's pockets. So it meant we had a new interface that we could work with. We could actually use our finger to scroll. It was a much more realistic experience. Think about reading a book. We go from reading a book to actually reading a book on a tablet or on a phone. And again, that experience of swiping was much more like the real world. So we created an interface there that was closer to reality. Still, it was a screen, but it was a very usable screen. And people, as one sees, go to the airport, everyone's on their phones. People have found they're now enjoying the experience of working on a computer in their pocket for using apps, communicating with people, etc., etc. So giant step forward, a new interface. I think what the Vision Pro represents, and it's not the only, Magic Leap is another one that's on the market. There's other ones on the market, but it's kind of shone the spotlight on the fact that we now have a new interface. And I like to hear the CEO of Magic Leap describe this in the interview the other day. She said, now we have computers in our eyes. And I love that. I think that's exactly what we're talking about here. So we've got computers in our eyes. And I think that the ski goggle, heavy, with a battery down your back version of this Vision Pro and the $5,500 price tag is really just the start of the journey. We always have to look at it and not get lost in the details and criticize it for all those things. It's begun that journey with some of these other guys into that new interface. And that new interface is going to be, again, much closer to how we work in reality. In fact, my big thing as a geospatial person is augmented reality. So it's that merging of the real world with the digital world. I have less interest in virtual reality where you're embedded in that environment and separated from the real world. My idea of what that looks like is where you actually see the real world, but you have that augmented with other things. I'm looking at a real glass and a digital glass. I can ask information of something that I'm looking at. And I thought it's intriguing that the Vision Pro tracks so closely one's eyes. So you can actually look and it'll focus, and then by a finger click, you'll actually select something. So it's very early into that journey, but I think that the interface is critical. I think the fact that the geospatial, and again, coming from geospatial, we have to know the location of all of those objects, where they are in space. So there is a connection to the digital world, which is geospatial, because it is X, Y, and Z that's important, and the real world, and putting those things in a real location. So data collection and this conversion of data into formats that are usable, the ability to pull back metadata that's geospatial is going to be enormous. And I also think that we're also building a full three-dimensional digital world as well. So the experience of 3D and digital reality on an interface like the one I've got here, my laptop, is really hard to navigate with a mouse, impossible. When you're actually got that as its new interface close in your eyes and you're navigating that world in a much more natural way, the digital version of reality, that's going to be a completely different experience. So I think this is absolutely enormous. I remember when I first saw the web, the internet in 1992, I thought, this is huge. And I was one of the few at the time was saying, this is just going to completely change the world. Same with mobile. When I first saw the first smartphone, actually even the first mobile phone, I was already in that place, and some of us were talking about that. The feeling I've got inside of where we are now after seeing this is even bigger. I'm even more excited. I can see the possibilities. So this is number one of a couple of other conversations I'll have around this emerging world that we're in. But I do think this new interface that has been released with the Vision Pro, and again, I'm not going to say that's the only one out there, but there's going to be a lot of talk about this augmented reality world thanks to this release. And the one I'll leave you with is, if anyone watched the announcement by Apple about that, how many times was the word spatial used? Spatial computing and spatial. Apple are going to make a big deal out of that word, and that is going to be a massive benefit to our spatial industry. So that's my talk for today. Thanks for watching. I'll do another one probably tomorrow.